My guest today is Gordon Tom.
I work as a senior advisor for the CO2 Coalition, which is based in Arlington, Virginia. Their membership is made up of about 120 scientists and researchers who are dedicated to educating the public and policymakers on the benefits of carbon dioxide and pushing back against the narrative of catastrophic global warming. And I also do work for the Commonwealth Foundation, which is a free market think tank based in Pennsylvania. I focus on energy issues. They focus more on a lot of other issues, but it's Pennsylvania focused, advancing free market policy proposals. My background is I've been researching, writing, speaking about energy issues for more than 40 years. First as a newspaper reporter in Western Pennsylvania, where there were a lot of coal mines and power plants and so forth. And then later as a communications executive in the nuclear power and electric utilities industries. I had been asked to speak earlier this year with the oil and gas producers in Pennsylvania, and more recently with another group in Eastern Pennsylvania. But anyhow, what we focused on, mostly what we talked about, was the threat of this net zero proposal around the globe, and also in Pennsylvania and the United States more broadly, the threat it poses to the electric grid. And what I wanted to first start out with was just a little bit of good news, and that is that there's no climate emergency, and there will be no climate emergency. As you may know, Tom, at the CO2 Coalition, we like to say, "I love CO2, and so should you." And I've been married more than 50 years. And I say that to my wife every night. And that's kind of the sorry state of my romance at this point. But I'm going to talk mostly about net zero and its threat to our way of lives, and even to our lives, actually. But first, I'll take a moment with a couple paragraphs about global warming. And the fact of the matter is that modern warming of the climate is neither unusual nor unprecedented. Most of the last 10,000 years have been warmer than today. 2,000 years ago, Romans grew citrus in northern England. 1,000 years ago, Vikings grew grain on Greenland. None of that is possible today. And if it were warm enough to do so, for the life of me, I don't know what the problem would be. It's well documented by 600 million years of geological evidence that CO2 levels are near a record low, and that atmospheric increases of the gas follow warming periods rather than precede them. This is probably because warming oceans release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and cooling oceans absorb the gas from the air. And just as, warm Coca-Cola tends to go flat because it releases the carbon dioxide, the carbonation from the fluid. And I take this mainly from people like William Happer and others, Greg Wrightstone, that these data alone are enough to demolish the assertion that atmospheric CO2 concentrations control Earth's climate, and the theory that combustion of fossil fuels will cause catastrophic warming. It will not. To repeat, the burning of fossil fuels, the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas, and the carbon dioxide they emit will not cause catastrophic warming. If there is any rise in temperature, it's likely to be too small to notice. In fact, a recent survey by Rasmussen reported that 60% of likely U.S. voters believe that climate change has become a religion that has more to do with political power than with environmental protection. Nevertheless, the so-called global elite at places like the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, as well as many of our national and state leaders, persist with the net zero mantra as they pursue some idealized version of Earth unsullied by humanity. Somehow, carbon-based creatures like human beings will be better off if carbon is eliminated. The logic is baffling. So in any event, back to net zero. In other words, the elimination of carbon dioxide emissions from electric generation, manufacturing, transportation, agriculture, and on and on. What I'm here to say is that net zero is technically impossible and environmentally damaging if it were to be implemented. Besides being unnecessary, net zero is destructive because the carbon dioxide it seeks to eliminate is actually beneficial, not harmful. A Wall Street Journal article earlier this year by Steve Malloy speaks to the feasibility of net zero. Malloy references a report by the Electric Power Research Institute, the research arm of electric utilities, commonly known by its acronym EPRI, E-P-R-I. Among other things, Malloy is author of Scare Pollution, which digs deep into the corruption of the Environmental Protection Agency. I recommend it. According to the EPRI report that Malloy references, quote, this study shows that clean electricity plus direct electrification and efficiency are not sufficient by themselves to achieve a net zero economy-wide emissions. In other words, Malloy writes, no amount of wind turbines, solar panels, hydropower, nuclear power, battery power, electrification of fossil fuel technologies, or energy efficiency technologies will get us to net zero by 2050. I would add, or ever. Analyst Dave Wojcik says net zero is impossible because it would cost too much. Quote, this is Wojcik speaking, writing, electricity storage at the scale needed to replace fossil fuels with wind and solar is impossibly expensive. Even assuming fantastic price reductions, and analysis shows the cost of the required battery storage still nearly equals the $23 trillion annual American gross domestic product. And he adds that the likely cost would be many times GDP. Wojcik calls on regulators to reverse the trend toward wind and solar to avert disaster. I might add, just in Pennsylvania, just recently, the governor of Pennsylvania wrote to the operators of the power grid that the answer to reliability was to add wind and solar. So he's going down a very bad track. When it comes to sucking 1.6 trillion tons of carbon dioxide out of the air, as John Kerry says we must do, be ready to spend $1 quadrillion. That is $1 million billion. And I have no idea how many ice cubes it would take to quell Al Gore's boiling oceans, but it's probably at least a quadrillion. As one commentator has said, the dividing line is no longer between right and left, or conservative and liberal, but rather between normal and crazy. And I'm here to tell you, I consider myself normal. So EPRI says shutting down all of our coal and gas plants and much else won't rid us of carbon dioxide emissions, and then adds this, quote, this study does not include a detailed assessment of factors such as supply chain constraints and operational reliability and resiliency of a net zero electricity grid. So yes, there is a little thing called the power grid. You know, the thousands of miles of high voltage lines and thousands of pieces of equipment like transformers, switches, sensors, and computers. That happens to be the technological wonder that makes modern society possible. In a report last year, the North American Electric Light Reliability Corporation raises numerous red flags about the injudicious removal of fossil fuel plants from the grid. These retirements are putting the country at risk of power failures, especially during extreme weather, whether it's extreme cold or extreme heat. In February of 2021, more than 200 people died in Texas in a Texas cold snap when an over-reliance on wind turbines led to extended blackouts. Last December, Kentucky had rolling blackouts when frozen equipment resulted in disruptions of natural gas supplies to power plant. During the same cold spell, PJM, the power grid serving Pennsylvania and my home state, and parts or all of 12 other states, came close to having similar blackouts when mostly gas-fired plants failed to perform. During a hearing on the Kentucky incident, legislators there complained to utility executives that replacing coal plants with wind and solar, had led to higher electric rates, and less reliability. There is a move in that state to preserve remaining coal plants threatened by closures. In Pennsylvania, alarm bells have been rung by both legislators and PJM. PJM says it will address the risk of retiring fossil plants too quickly. We hope so. Perhaps a much-needed seriousness is being brought to the issue of reliability. However, for quite some time, quite some time, years. Answers to questions about reliability have been circular. In my home state, state government would point to grid operators as the experts. Grid operators would say they are simply following state policies, such as requirements to institute some minimum amount of renewable, so-called renewable, generation. In her book, Shorting the Grid, a book I highly recommend, by the way, in her book, Shorting the Grid, Meredith Angwin says politicians regularly ignore that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, as they make laws requiring greenness in grids. She writes, quote, "The laws of nature are not repealed by those renewable mandate laws, and yet the laws are passed. Renewable mandate laws have unrealistic plans for renewables, to put it mildly. They will not succeed in building grids that are 100% renewable. However, such laws will succeed in making the grid more fragile and more expensive." Ms. Angwin suggests that decisions about grid operations are too often influenced by those who are more invested in their own interest than in the well-being of consumers. That would be us, the electric users. The interests of consumers, of course, reside mostly in affordability and reliability. For example, in February, a Commonwealth Foundation survey found that voters overwhelmingly believe that Pennsylvanians' most pressing energy issue is rising costs. Voters are about 3 times as likely to identify costs as they are to name environmental consequences when considering energy as an issue. Last year, PJM's installed capacity by fuel source was approximately 48% gas, 25% coal, and 17% nuclear. Solar and wind accounted for just 1% each. So after decades of subsidies, governmental cheerleading, and overpromising by the climate industrial complex, solar and wind stand in single-digit percentages for capacity. Nonetheless, the push for solar and wind continues. PJM projects that it will lose 40 gigawatts of generating capacity by 2030. That's 21% of the market's existing capacity. That's roughly equal to losing the electricity needed to power 30 million homes. Over the same period, PJM has only 31 gigawatts of additions projected. And while the losses will be primarily from coal plants closing, and these are plants that can provide electricity continuously, the proposed additions will be largely from intermittent, unreliable wind and solar. Again, this is all in the name of net zero, decarbonated, green nirvana. Few members of the public are being fooled, however. A poll by Heart and Mind Strategies from Reston, Virginia, found that 27% of Americans, just 27% of Americans, think net zero is even possible. Nearly 40% think it's probably impossible, and a third just don't know. By the way, the same poll reports that 73% of Americans agree that it is important for the U.S. to be energy independent. We only wish some of our leaders would start listening to what the public has to say. So in February, the CO2 Coalition published a paper that found net zero to be scientifically invalid. And far from being a pathway to paradise, net zero, they found, the paper finds, is a threat to the lives of billions of people. Billions with a B of people. Two of the paper's authors, Drs. William Happer and Richard Lindzen, are professors emeriti at Princeton University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, respectively. They have spent decades researching the physics of Earth's atmosphere. The third is Gregory Wrightstone. Gregory, by the way, happens to be a personal friend of mine. I've known him for more than a decade now. He wrote the book, Inconvenient Facts, the science that Al Gore doesn't want you to know. And I've had the privilege of editing the book for him. Greg is a geologist of more than 40 years who spent much of the last decade writing and speaking about the interplay of geology, history, and climate. So among this paper's findings are the following. 1, net zero proponents regularly report that extreme weather is more severe and frequent because of climate change. The evidence shows just the opposite. Computer models supporting governmental regulations and the trillions of dollars subsidizing renewables and electric vehicles and the like do not work. Complicated computer models predicting overwarming do not work. Of 102 such models, 101 fail to replicate observations in the real world. Scientific research and studies that do not support the so-called consensus narrative of harmful man-made global warming are routinely censored and excluded from government reports. The many benefits of modest warming and increasing carbon dioxide are routinely eliminated or minimized in government reports. And finally, eliminating fossil fuels means doing away with nitrogen fertilizers and pesticides and leaving half the world's population without enough food. Many would starve. In short, the paper finds the intellectual basis for net zero violates the tenets of a scientific method that for more than 400 years, since the time of Isaac Newton, has underpinned the advancement of human civilization. I'm going to mention one more paper by the CO2 Coalition. It's entitled, "Fossil Fuels Are the Greenest Energy Sources." The author is Dr. Inder Goklani. He holds degrees in electrical engineering from Michigan State University and the Indian Institute of Technology at Bombay. He's a 30-year veteran of the climate debate and author of several books. Some of what Dr. Goklani reports is as follows. Satellite data show that 25 to 50% of the Earth's vegetated areas became greener between 1982 and 2011. 25 to 50% of the Earth's vegetated areas became greener. Researchers attribute 70% of the greening to CO2 fertilization from the emissions of fossil fuel combustion, and 9% from the use of fertilizers derived from fossil fuels. At least 20% of land area has been saved from being converted to agricultural purposes because of increased agricultural productivity. From the use of modern farm machinery, pesticides, and fertilizers, all dependent on fossil fuels, the amount of land saved is about 25% larger than the North American continent. This is my favorite from the Goklani paper. Fossil fuel dependent technologies have increased agricultural yields by at least 167%. As a result, we are now supporting 10 times the number of people that lived before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So that now today we have 8 billion people. Prior to 1750, there were fewer than 800 million. And they're better fed today. Power plants fueled by coal and natural gas require about 12 acres of land per megawatt hour of electricity. To produce the same amount of electricity, solar needs more than 3 times as much land, wind 5 times as much, and hydropower 25 times as much. And finally, the International Energy Agency reports that solar and wind energy require more metals and minerals than plants powered by fossil fuels. If you average it out, it's about 10 times more. Indeed, in my view, fossil fuels are the greenest energy sources. They are treasures to be valued. The demonization of them is irrational and ruinous. Critics of these fuels routinely exaggerate and sometimes outright fabricate their negative effects while ignoring altogether their enormous benefits. And if I can have just one more minute, I'd like to make a little pitch for Western civilization, which seems to be pretty important, historically speaking. To do that, I'm going to refer to the music of an old movie and its score being played by the Danish National Symphony of all things. So the movie is the 1967 film, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I've only watched it about a half dozen times over the years. Consider that this is a film of a quintessentially American genre, the Western, starring an iconic American actor, Clint Eastwood. It was written, directed, produced, and scored by Italians. It was filmed partially in Spain. The landscapes representing the American Southwest in the movie are actually in southern Spain, which I happened to visit once on a business trip. It's beautiful. The Danish orchestra is conducted by a Japanese-American woman born in Tokyo and raised in Hawaii. And some clever I recommend just going on YouTube and calling up Danish National Symphony, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It'll come right up. It's a wonderful performance. Some clever visuals in the performance are a mezzo-soprano wearing six-shooter earrings, and the image of a man hanging from a noose in the middle of a stunningly beautiful Copenhagen concert hall. What I got from the performance, at least, is the beauty and incredible variety of Western civilization. And I think we can all agree that art like that could not be made possible to many millions of people the way it is today without the wealth and technologies of our carbon-based economy. A point that I want to make has to do with the remarkable mix of talent and personal backgrounds that went into the film and the music. Spanning a period of 50 years, the work of a wide variety of people from all over the world culminated in this performance. And it's the kind of globalism that I embrace. I enthusiastically embrace it. I think most of us would. Why not? The collaboration in the performance is the kind, it's the human spirit incarnate. However, the globalism that would impose dangerous concepts like net zero is another thing entirely. It is an obnoxious tyranny that every lover of freedom and of modern life should resist. And to that end, I would urge everybody listening to stand vigorously, even fiercely, for our freedom to produce electricity and manufacture goods with the most affordable and reliable fuels available to us. Coal and oil fueled the Industrial Revolution and gave us unprecedented prosperity and health. Together with natural gas, they promised to raise billions of people in developing countries from poverty and deprivation. Modern economies simply cannot survive without hydrocarbons. End of story. And those who demonize these fuels and promote the absurd notion that a harmless gas will destroy the planet, threaten our way of life, and possibly our very lives. And that's what I've had to say recently to people willing to sit and listen.
You have given similar speeches at various real-world locations, right? I'm just curious what sort of questions they have or how is it received?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you asked that, actually, because 2 weeks ago, I spoke to a group of kind of like Central Eastern Pennsylvanians. It was a kind of a patriots group, which I was not familiar with, but they had invited us. I originally said, I have about 20 minutes. They said, give us 35 minutes. Okay, 35 minutes. So I threw in some other stuff. And I end up, long story short, I end up speaking for a full 35 minutes to 180 people in a structure that sort of reminded me of a cross between an airplane hangar and a hockey rink. But these people were the most welcoming and engaged group. I've been doing this off and on for 40 years, talking about various subjects, right? They were the most welcoming and engaged group I ever stood in front of. I finished after 35 minutes. They asked questions for at least another 15 and then stood in line 8 and 10 deep to either just shake my hand or ask another question. And they were just, I was really impressed by the group, but there's a lot of interest here on this subject with certain people.
Very good. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. I wanted to see if you wanted to say a little bit more about Inconvenient Facts, the app and the book. I saw on Amazon, it now has over 2,300 ratings. It's a solid 5-star. I think it's doing very well. Do you have any more to add about that? You were primary editor of the whole thing, right?
Right. Yeah. Inconvenient Facts was written by Gregory Wrightstone, as I mentioned, 6 years ago. 6 years ago. And it still shows up #1 on Amazon in certain categories. And it was kind of much, as I was editing it was very educational for me, because I was always skeptical of this climate change thing. Even when I was first introduced to the subject, it was the late 1980s. I was working media relations and public affairs at a nuclear power plant. And the nuclear industry at the time was quick to jump on the climate change issue, because they saw it as a way to promote their technology. And I did not feel comfortable with it. If somebody would ask me about it as a spokesman for the nuclear plant, I said, well, if anybody has any concerns about carbon emissions, nuclear power is certainly a technology they ought to be interested in. But I wouldn't flog the issue, so to speak. I just did not feel comfortable doing that. In any event, so I kind of read some of Patrick Michael's stuff. I think his book was the first one I read in the 1990s. And then when Greg came along, Greg and I had been friends for a while because we had similar political interests. In early 2017, he sent me a chapter. He said, I've written a chapter based on a slide presentation I did a year ago. I think maybe I'll write a book. And so I read the chapter, or maybe it's 2 chapters, I don't remember, but I emailed him back from the hotel I was staying at. And I said, I think this is pretty good, Greg. I said it could use a little editing. He goes, well, who can edit it? I said, oh, I guess I can. He said, that's how we started. and we learned, I learned from him, and he learned as he researched, and I learned from him. And by the time it was all over, as we were approaching the end of the book, I thought, not only is this climate change unnecessary, it might be actually harmful. The measures they're putting in, like, who wants to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the air when it's so beneficial to plants and ultimately to human beings? So it was quite an experience.
Yeah, Greg has a lot of praise for you in the acknowledgments for the book. I'm just looking at that right here. But here's a good quote. It says, not long into the process, you told him, Greg, I had suspected for years that we were being lied to about this, but I had no idea just how pervasive it really was. Excellent quote. As you dug in more and more, you found more and more interesting stuff, didn't you?
Yeah, exactly.
All lies. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's just crazy. It's, and there's so many smart people who, for whatever reason, seem to buy into it. Some of it, the reason is I can make up reasons. It's the reason some of, I think it's a self-interest. Some people are just honestly fooled by it. I don't, but I think it's Richard Lindzen, and I won't be able to quote him directly, but he says something along the lines of, so the day will come when people will scratch their heads over how could that many people be fooled by such a silly argument.
I really like the fact that you have, I think, a list of 60 inconvenient facts, and you can just look at them one at a time. Here's what they tell you. Here's what the truth is. And then I think you can get along this path of, if they're lying to us about this, what else are they lying to us about? And it just keeps going.
Right. And I have on my phone, you can have there's an inconvenient facts app for iPhone and Android, and you can call up these 60 inconvenient facts, rather easily. And they're all sourced and so forth. So it's not just something that was made up.
I'm interested that the book is available in so many different formats. Like you mentioned, you have it as in the form of an app, but it's an audio book. It's on Kindle. It's in the form of a real physical book. Do you have any sense as to which one's the most popular, or
I don't. I know Greg is still getting lots of requests for the paper version. I have both versions, of course, but and it's been translated into Norwegian, Korean. Last I heard, it was being worked on being translated into Portuguese. And I may be missing some. I'm not sure. But Greg is actually working on a second book. So I don't think I can go into that yet. You know how writers are; they don't like to. I think they think it's superstitious to talk about it.
Do you think you might be doing some sort of revised edition of this book as they come up with new lies? Or it seems like they're going to continue with the same one, continue saying tornadoes are getting worse when they're not, all that stuff.
Yeah, Greg has talked about maybe updating this book. I think some of that will happen in the second book. The CO2 Coalition is on the verge of launching an educational initiative. They've already published 3 comic books for children on the subject of carbon dioxide and related subjects. And and they have, I think, 4 videos, and all these books and the videos have lesson plans for teachers. And I'm really excited about it. I have not been involved in it at all. I don't have any idea what teaching's about. I think I would be pretty bad at it, but there are people very skilled at it and very experienced at it who have worked on this project. I think it's got real possibilities to make a difference over time. Thank you, Tom. Nice meeting you.
All right. Talk to you later. Yeah, bye.
Okay. Bye.